Thank you very much. And first of all, it's an immense pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, Filippo, for this invitation, because this is an opportunity to, let's say, to work together again. And given that we started many years ago in Italy. And so thank you to Filippo, Caterina, and also Victoria and Pasquale for this invitation. And I'm happy to be here in this context. I know that this is a context, a workshop with PhD candidates. Yes, English, which is the language that now we use in digital technologies. Of course, we have the language is English for various reasons. Of course, we need more data also in other European languages. But anyway, so digital technologies for the ancient world. This is a big title. We could devote an entire course to that because we mean many different things. Considering this context and also my background, by ancient world, of course, I will refer to the Greco-Roman world first. In the digital technologies, I will show you a few possibilities, and also I will focus on textuality. I will not talk about digital archaeology or digital epigraphy, digital papyrology, where today we have many interesting projects, and especially epigraphy and papyrology, or also manuscript studies, are fundamental for us working in history and philology, of course. But I will focus on text and also on primary sources, because again, digital technologies can be used especially for digitizing primary and secondary sources. So we have a multitextuality. And I would like to focus for this Vortrag on three main concepts using three well-known expressions: open access, open data, text analysis. I would like to focus on the question of accessibility, which is something not new for us, because as scholars, as humanists, we need to access sources since the past. So this is not really a new thing. The new thing is that we have a digital environment now where we have specific needs. So we will see let's say, issues in terms of, but also possibilities in terms of accessibility. How can we access ancient sources? And what do we mean by data? And then we will see also open data. What do we mean by open data for ancient Greek and Latin? And then for the last part of this talk, we will see a few examples of analysis. When we have digital data, what can we do with this data? Many things. Again, so I will focus on a few examples because, of course, we have many various possibilities. But the first part, open access. Open access is a well-known expression used today in different fields. It's used also in scholarship. And open access is difficult to, especially the adjective open can be misleading. But open access is important because it's about accessibility, of course. And generically, we can define open access as a series of practices and principles for accessing for free scholarly publications and also materials. In general, for scholarship, not only in the humanities. But open access is something more than that, and especially open doesn't simply mean free. And I will have examples for that. But open access for us scholars is important because this is not only about accessing, finding sources, but also providing other scholars and students and citizens with access to our data. So you are young scholars, you are going to produce data. I'm using this English expression. You are going to publish your dissertation, papers, monographs, and also possibly digital data. But today we have important questions. How can other scholars and students access your data? We have traditional papers and monographs. We know that workflow. But with digital data, we have other issues, other questions, also because you want, of course, other people to read, to use your data, but you want also to preserve your intellectual contribution. And we know that online data can be complex in this sense. So open access is a complex let's say, concept in this sense. But if we want to focus on ancient Greek and Latin sources, primary sources for open access, so if a scholar, a student, or also a citizen, a passionate about the ancient world, is looking for ancient sources, ancient Greek and Latin sources, where he or she can find these sources. And here I have put in this slide a few icons belonging to different projects. I put them at random, and I did that on purpose, not to give you the sense of a chaotic situation, but because it's true that today you can find a huge amount of ancient sources online, but in different projects with different characteristics. And this is about accessibility. Here I put projects for Greek and Latin, projects about literary sources, texts coming from papyri, from inscriptions, and also projects born in different institutions and places. Of course, this is just a selection of some of the most important projects, but of course we could cite also other resources. But again, open access. So if you use these projects, you can find text in these projects. The thing is that in terms of open access, we should consider this. Today we have many digital collections and corpora for ancient Greek and Latin, but when you use these resources, you should always consider characteristics of these projects. Of course, usually we look for text. Maybe we find ancient Greek and Latin text. We copy and paste them because we have to produce slides for a conference, or we have to write a paper, etc. But we should always consider first the fact that today, in 2025, these projects were born in different times. We have projects dating back to the 50s or 60s of last century. So digital humanities is not so new as a discipline. And so we can find old data, and then also in different countries. And this is important to remember. These projects were born in different institutions like research centers, publishing companies, libraries, archives, and also with different funds. And this is important because you always have to consider where and why these projects were born, or for new projects, where they come from. Because institutions like libraries, archives, or research centers, departments, of course, have different goals and needs. This is important. Then these projects, they offer data in one or more ancient languages, only ancient Greek, only Latin, both, maybe other historical languages, or maybe only translations into modern languages. Definitely, we still miss data. We still need to digitize more sources. Then they can provide access to sources from different periods, the Archaic Age, late antiquity. So this is why we have limited collections sometimes. And then they also, we can find these texts in projects about the different genres and disciplines. Again, we can find a text in project for digital epigraphy, or papyrology, or manuscript studies, or projects focus on history, historiography, philosophy, philology, etc. But I think that it is important to understand not only the amount of text that you find, but also formats and standards used for, let's say, publishing these texts. And we will go back to this. The second important aspect of open access is also that today you can find data online, text, primary sources, in different formats and standards. And I will mention a few of them in a few minutes. And this is about accessibility, again, because you can find maybe a website and you can read the text in an HTML page, but this is not enough. Or maybe behind, you can find the data and you can download these texts in specific formats like XML, CSV, JSON. So there are specific formats to structure our text. And this is, I think, a crucial thing for open access, because accessibility is not only about accessing for free text, but is also to access these texts in a way that the machine can analyze this text. So maybe you can find projects with a paywall, but with good structured data, or maybe projects that are free, but in the end they give you, they are just, and I don't want to simplify, but maybe they are a good website, but you can't really use this text, for example, for text mining. And then finally, so you begin to see accessibility. Accessibility is a complex term. And then finally, we have to consider different business models, in the sense that, you know, there are resources that are free, maybe with CC licenses, which are important because CC licenses inform us about the way we can use this data. And then other projects are behind a paywall. They need a subscription. I can't talk about the business model, but I think that we should, as scholars, of course, discuss also the business model, if this is not our job, but we should be aware of that. And also for you, you are young scholars, because producing research is expensive. Today, we have not only papers and monographs, printed editions, but digital data. And sustaining research in this sense is problematic. The big question today is who is going to pay for what? So how can we distribute costs for research? And this is important, especially when you want to write also a research proposal, for example. So to understand exactly the resources that you have, that you are asking for, how we can use them in these workflows. So this is why the business model is a part of open access and open. Open, you know that there are different also models for open access, especially with publishing companies and libraries. But again, behind, of course, there is a big question about the business model. But this was the first part for, let's say, open access, so accessibility, the complexity of accessibility for data. Of course, you can find for open access, and I'm sure you already know that, many bibliographic references, discussions online. I would recommend to, especially you are young scholars, so to read something about open access. I'm here referring to 3 monographs, interesting. Peter Zuber has written a lot about open access. He's an expert of open access, especially the first monograph is interesting. It's a short monograph where you can find the key concepts of open access for scholarship. And interesting is also the other book by Martin Paul Eve, Open Access and the Humanities, which is important for us, we are humanists, especially for discussions about the future, for example, of the traditional monograph. I think we still need to write books and monographs, definitely, but how can we provide access to our monographs, and how can we combine, for example, the traditional monograph and traditional papers with digital data? I think that these books are interesting, but of course you can find many other resources online. Then open data, so connected to open access, to accessibility, we have the concept of open data. Open data can be understood in connection with one of the missions of the World Wide Web Consortium. Here you can see the main statement of the W3C Consortium, which is to work on principles of accessibility, internationalization, privacy, and security. Of course, these principles are important also for our work as classicists and as humanists, especially accessibility, also security in some sense, because that's the thing. So we are producing data, but how can we sustain this data? But open data. Open data is connected to the mission of the World Wide Web Consortium, and especially to the semantic web. Because, as you know, the semantic web refers to the vision of the World Wide Web Consortium for the web of linked data. This is another expression, linked data. And if linked data is open, we say linked open data. I'm not going into technical details, but the main thing is to produce digital structured data, and I will have examples for that. So data that can be read by the machine, which is the first a goal. And then second, to provide this data with the stable identifiers so that we can find this data, cite this data, and connect, link this data with meaningful semantic links, not just hyperlinks. I think that these concepts are interesting because this is what we have been doing for many, many years and centuries, in the sense that as classicists, we generate data about the Greco-Roman world, but since the past, we have been always producing citation systems, identifiers. If you think of conventions that we use to cite text, to cite fragments, for example, there are many conventions. These are stable identifiers, and we have been always representing relationships among data. If you consider the sources that we study, we represent meaningful semantic relationships among this data. For example, a text and the citations that you find in the text, relationships between the author and the text, etc. So these concepts are not really new, especially for us, for our work as humanists and classicists. The thing is that in a digital environment, we should transfer these concepts considering the needs of the machine. And for linked open data, there is an initiative called Linked Ancient World Data, which is following these principles of the semantic web for historical languages in general, and specifically also for Greco-Roman studies. In this slide, I have put many things together. You have bibliographic references if you're interested in the topic, especially the paper by Hugh Cales, which is not technical, but is a good introduction to link the data and to the problem of sustainability, including partly also the business model. And then you have the main principles again, producing structured data, generating stable identifiers, and linking this data with the semantic meaningful relationships. And then on the right, you have again the icons of a few projects. We could mention other projects where you can find open data and link the data. I also included Open Context, which is for archaeology, and Nomisma, which is a project for numismatic. But you can find definitely bibliographic references to these projects. So open access and open data. Let's consider an example of a text. If we consider, this is a page, the opening page of the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides in the edition by Stuart Jones and Powell, the Oxford edition. This is structured data. This is a page where we have a text, an ancient text with a structure established over the centuries, because traditionally now we read the text of Thucydides arranged in books, chapters, and paragraphs. And a page like this is structured data because we have a structure of the text, which is the result of a long tradition and the transmission of the text, but is also depending on the technology of the book, the printed book. Sometimes we forget that. But in a single page like this, we find, as we know, conventions and devices for reading the text, like the numbers on the right for chapters and paragraphs, on the left line numbers, and then of course below the critical apparatus, where in very few lines we have a summary of a long tradition. We know that, you say, yes, we know that. Sometimes we forget that because we live in the age of printed critical editions, but this is a piece of super advanced technology. All these conventions are the result of a long work. The problem for us is that we should, let's say, transfer this structure in a digital format where we have other needs. And also the critical apparatus, which is the complex part, because we have conventions, we have examples of unique and stable identifiers. Today, again, speaking of sources, there are many projects working on this aspect, and we have to say that digital humanities started in classics with this need. Also the TAG, the Thesaurus Lingua Graeca, the digital project started in the 70s of last century to try to digitize a source like this. At the time, it was not possible to represent ancient polytonic Greek. And if you use the TLG, I don't know if you know that, but at the time we used beta code, basically Latin characters to represent Greek and diacritics. Today, we can represent ancient polytonic Greek. I'm showing you an example of the same text of Thucydides, the same edition in the Scaife viewer, which is the reading environment of the Perseus project. And behind the web page, of course, we have structured data. Structured data means that in these collections and corpora, we preserve the traditional structure of a text like this by books, chapters, and paragraphs, which is important. And then, as you can see, we also have stable identifiers to point to the text. I can't go into details about this, but you can find bibliography. These identifiers in red expressed with URNs, which are uniform resource names, used in many, many different projects, also libraries use in general URNs, but also projects in science. The idea is to translate conventional, traditional citations into a digital format. And basically, these identifiers are interesting because in a single identifier, you want to have different levels of granularity. So we want to cite, for example, Thucydides as an author, his text, but then we want to go down to a specific edition of the text of an ancient author like Thucydides, and possibly also cite, for example, the first word, the name, the opening, Thucydides, the name of the author. As you can begin to see, so there is a lot of focus today on digitizing ancient sources, representing them in a proper way, preserving also the complex structure of modern editions. And an identifier like this represents the fact that these texts belong to a specific domain, which is ancient Greek literature, and then there are different editions of the text. In this page, I'm showing on the right also other tools, let's say, that you can find in this resource, where you have, for example, the morphology, also the TLG for ancient Greek. As you will see, I have many examples for ancient Greek, like Latin. You can guess why. But anyway, so we have also many other resources also for Latin, where there is today a lot of work on not only digitizing sources, but also analyzing linguistically the sources. And I will say in a few minutes why. But behind a text like this, what we want to find is structured data. So we can have a web page, which is good for us as human beings to read the text, possibly, but hopefully behind we would like to have something like that. I don't know if you know about XML. Probably you already know. I'm sorry if I mention basic things, but I know that the audience is mixed. And so, of course, that's the thing. So the idea, and XML is extensible markup language, is a possibility to represent ancient sources. A text like this preserves for the machine the structure of a text, which is fundamental because we want to preserve the structure of our text and to represent in a proper way, for example, a text like this, which is in ancient Greek. And this text is part of the repositories of the Perseus digital library. Of course, we also have other collections for ancient Greek and Latin, which are producing text in structured formats for the machine. The important thing is that a text like this is strictly connected with the catalog and with metadata about the author and the work, in the sense that this text, this is a screenshot, is part of repositories where you can find many other texts. And I have summarized in this slide many things, in the sense that the text of Thucydides is available in an open repository online in GitHub. And these repositories, where you can find not only the text of Thucydides, but also other XML files with metadata about, again, the example is Thucydides and his work, is strictly connected to the catalog, which is the Perseus catalog. Above you can see two screenshots from the Perseus catalog, which has a website, but also structured data. The important thing is that a resource like the Perseus catalog is connected with library, international and national library systems, starting with the Library of Congress, but also other library systems like the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek also, where it is possible to ingest metadata. So what I'm trying to show with this single slide is that today, but this is something that we have been always representing, we can represent, and we want to represent this connection between the text and his transmission and the catalog and other metadata. Of course, we can expand now because we can really, through identifiers, through a structured text with specific identifiers, we can connect the text to the catalog where we have a collection of metadata, like in this example, simple example, the name of Thucydides, metadata about Thucydides, and for his work, connections with many possible editions of the text, translations and commentaries. And this is why you can see, so linked data, I hope you can get a sense of linked data, which is, this is the semantic, meaningful relationship between the text and the domain, which can be Greek literature and then classical literature, world literature, and then possible metadata. So this is about the work and the author and the catalog, which is again something that we are used to that since the past. If you consider the Library of Alexandria, you mentioned my work, we can find those needs at the time. First of all, to collect a corpus. The canon also is strictly connected to this, and then create the catalog. There are many discussions about the catalogs of the Alexandrian Library, but the catalog, first of all, was a critical, let's say, analysis of the corpus collected in those ancient libraries, defining genres and other texts and other problems concerning the text. So we find ancient old concepts now in a digital environment. I would like to conclude this part mentioning another interesting fundamental aspect. So as you can see, so the first need, and we already have a Corpora, but is still to produce open data in this sense, not just free data, but structured data, when we preserve ancient sources with their structure, including possibly the critical apparatus, which is another problem. But strictly connected to this is also character encoding. I want to mention this because character encoding, today we can represent a language like ancient Greek and other historical languages. With Latin, we have less problems, even if sometimes we have problems. But today, ancient polytonic Greek is portable. Filippo is a bit younger than me, but I think you remember times where ancient Greek was less portable in the sense that we could write in ancient Greek, but then you use another software or another browser and you couldn't read properly Greek. Today, thanks to Unicode, we can properly represent ancient Greek, but still there are issues. I'm mentioning this because if you want to work with digital humanities, the first thing you have to do is to create a corpus of your text, the text you want to analyze. You have your corpus, but you should also try to have not only a clean text, yes, without mistakes. We know that today there are collections, including Perseus, I have to say that, where you can find text that still have errors due to the OCR. I will mention that after. But there are also other hidden mistakes, like a non-consistent character encoding. By character encoding, we mean basically the possibility to represent, to encode writing systems, including historical languages. And I have examples in this slide from this paper, which is very interesting, character encoding for classical languages and classical philology. In the sense, you can find a text where the Greek capital alpha is represented as an A, or other problems like how can we represent the final sigma if it is just a variant glyph or a different character. Or, most importantly, for example, with the diacritics. So if we have an epsilon with an acute accent, do we represent it as one character or the combination of two characters? You say, but why do we have to be interested in that? We want to read ancient sources. Well, this is important because a text like this is correct. You read it, it's Greek, ancient Greek is correct. But behind, maybe we have inconsistencies. And these inconsistencies can affect your searches, for example, in a database, and then you preserve wrong information. So this is important. So character encoding is interesting. And you can find also bibliography about that. And if you go to the Unicode website where you can find the charts, you can find interesting things. Another problem, because ancient classical Greek, we can represent it, but there are other issues. And I will mention an example like this for epigraphy. And I said that I wouldn't talk about epigraphy, but I have to mention that. Today, we can't represent archaic scripts, for example, for ancient Greek. So in this vase, we can see a few letters, theta, eta, the 3 bar sigma, which is used at the beginning of the 5th century. We can't represent it. We can't encode it. And if we look for a similar chart like this is not the 3 bar sigma, but this is the Greek small letter Copt, which is available in the Unicode chart for Greek and Coptic. You say, well, we are not interested in these things. But I think that classicists should sit at some point and discuss about this. Because, for example, for epigraphy, we can't yet represent encoding. And this is a specific example for a specific alphabet, the Greek alphabet, so the archaic alphabets where we have these sigma, the 3 bar sigma. But this is important also for your text. If you create your corpus and you want to use your corpus for text mining the corpus, but also in ChatGPT, given that ChatGPT is used a lot today, you can put the text in ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is quite good at reading the text. Still, you have to remember that we can still find in our corpora issues in terms of character encoding. But then I would like to move to the final part, text analysis. So I wanted to spend time on open accessibility and data. So the goal is, again, because my focus is on primary sources, of course, we also have to consider that today there are many projects digitizing, of course, with secondary sources. So like digitizing, of course, monographs, papers, but also other elements of a critical edition, like the critical apparatus and also the indices, for example, of critical editions. In the Open Greek and Latin project, we are doing that because critical editions are important not just for the reconstructed text, but also for the critical apparatus and for other paratextual elements like indices. Especially in the critical editions of the 19th century, you can find those useful indices, lists of author names or names or place names that can be used for example, for training the machine, if we want to extract from our text place names, proper names. So there are many resources, especially in older editions, I have to say, especially in indices, which can be interesting for our work. But still, let's talk about primary sources. Also, the critical apparatus is still a problem. You know that in many collections like the TAG, the Perseus Digital Library, you find only the reconstructed text because for two main reasons, because digitizing the critical apparatus is complex, especially for OCR, and also because there are also copyright issues. So there are cases in which you can digitize the reconstructed text, but not the critical apparatus because it's the part protected by copyright. And also because the focus is more on trying to digitize every text of antiquity. And then the second step will be also to include the critical apparatus. But text analysis, and again, data entry, before you analyze the text, again, we have to digitize ancient sources. We are doing that. We already have many corpora because you have to start with a corpus. So if you want to use digital technologies today, the first thing is to have a corpus that you can analyze. And the corpus can be a corpus defined by language, by period of time, by genres, etc. So you can create your own corpus. And traditionally, how can we digitize a text? So we have different methods. The first is optical character recognition, which is used in general for transforming an image, like a PDF, into a machine-readable format. OCR is used for printed editions mainly. I have in this slide again the reference to a paper, a colleague of mine, Bruce Robertson, who is really an expert of OCR for ancient Greek, which is, of course, a dead language, and so OCR is developed more for contemporary languages, of course. But for ancient Greek, we have now excellent results, where basically the idea is to transform a page like this, where we have only the Greek text. In other cases, difficulties come when we have also the critical apparatus, and to transform it into a digital text. Of course, there are discussions about using OCR. For example, many publishing companies prefer the method of double keying. So people really writing the Greek text and then comparing the two versions. So ideally, you should have 2 or 3 persons scoping the text, and then you can compare them to find errors, because we always generate mistakes, of course, with the machine or also without the machine. And in fact, part of the work that we still have to consider is edit OCR errors. And this is again about accessibility, in the sense that you can find today text, if you are looking for them for creating your corpus, or if you want to use OCR, because maybe you want to work on a text, but the text is not available in digital format, you can use OCR for ancient Greek, for Latin, but then you have to consider that these methods are not perfect. It's impossible. So you should define a workflow for checking possible mistakes, those that are visible, or also inconsistencies. This is why character encoding is interesting, because especially when you have a text where you have a mixture of Greek and Latin, like the critical apparatus or commentaries of old editions, things are a bit problematic. And this is a screenshot from the Fragmenti Historicorum Graecorum, the project, where I experimented with an interface for editing OCR errors. This is one method. Then I have to mention for the other method, which is about not printed editions, but today you can find projects. There was a video actually in the original slides, but just from Transcribus. The other source of text, of course, are manuscripts. I'm mentioning only printed editions, but of course there are many projects today for digitizing manuscripts, not only for providing access to the images, and now you have wonderful images online, I have to say, but also to transcribe the text. And this is also one of the reasons why we don't have so many digital editions, because today the effort is on transcribing an entire manuscript, which is time-consuming. Also, if you use a technology like handwritten text recognition, and a tool like Transcribus. I don't know if you are using Transcribus, you know that, but still is a long process, because the idea is possibly to transcribe the manuscripts ideally, and this is where the concept of critical apparatus is changing a bit, not just to have the traditional apparatus, which is a summary of the transmission of a text at the bottom of a page, still again strongly depending on the technology of the printed book, where you have the limit of the page, but ideally to transcribe every manuscript and to align them, to see variants, also mistakes. There is a big discussion in digital philology about the future of the critical apparatus, going beyond the traditional apparatus, which is a selection of variants and conjectures. This is an interesting thing. Anyway, I'm mentioning handwritten text recognition because this is there are projects also for trying to recognize text from papyri, for example. Of course, here we have many challenges because, as you know, so recognizing handwritten text is quite challenging. You can define patterns for literary text, for example. For papyrology is a nightmare, especially for documentary papyri. But still, because the problem is that we want to convert these texts. We can have printed editions and manuscripts to generate machine-readable text, data entry, and then finally text analysis. So when we have our corpus, of course, which is the first important thing. And I know that because I am a classicist, and I learned that you can say, okay, my interest is to study problems of ancient literature. I want to study an ancient author, an ancient text. I want to say to write something new about this author. But I think that sometimes we forget our duty, which is also to preserve the sources that have been transmitted to us. So in this historical moment, part of scholarship should be devoted to these practical problems in philology, in general in classical antiquity, to create clean corpora, structured corpora, because we need them. So this is why I know that digital humanities is focused on these practical things like digitizing a text, improving OCR, or using double keying, improving handwritten text recognition, sit together and discuss about character encoding, because this is the way for properly preserving information about the ancient world. So we are going through the digital. So the focus is a bit different from traditional scholarship, where we want to write a new commentary about an ancient source. So this is important. But anyway, when you have your corpus, your corpora, and your text, you want to analyze them. And this, of course, you need a research question, first of all, of course, this is important. And then what you can do today, many things. I'm for the last 10 minutes, and I'm a bit slow, but I will finish because I know that it's 6:30. I imagine that you are a bit tired, but I will go through the last slides. Text analysis. Today, in terms of text analysis, Filippo before mentioned text mining, of course, which is digital. So we can mine a text, or a corpus for different research questions. And here, of course, this is the difficulty, because you say, okay, I need to learn digital humanities, maybe I need to learn a programming language, etc. This is a part of the problem. The other thing is that many projects today are focused on analyzing the language of our text, first of all. And in this slide, I have this grid from the CLTK, the Classical Language Toolkit, which is an interesting resource using methods from natural language processing for analyzing historical text. And I'm mentioning this because you can see in this grid ancient languages, historical languages, and different, let's say, method working on corpora, stop list, sentence tokenizer. So these are terms from computational linguistics. And this is important today because definitely there is, again, a closer relationship between, let's say, philology and literature and linguistics, something that we lost in the past. But now definitely we need computational linguistics, because in any case, in philology historiography, the first task is to read the text. I think we learned when we were very young at the university. This is at least the big lesson. First, read the text. Then you can have a focus on the history, historiography, philology, literature. But the same text can be analyzed in many different ways. But the language is fundamental. And in fact, linguistics in this sense is interesting. The problem is that we miss data in a digital environment. And so we need to start with basic tasks, difficult tasks, but basic tasks. For example, first, you have a good corpus, a clean corpus. You want to tokenize the corpus, basically individuating the smallest units corresponding to words and punctuation. Then you want to lemmatize. Ancient Greek and Latin are highly inflected languages. So we need to identify these inflected forms, lemmatize them, as we do traditionally, and then step by step we can analyze the morphology, the syntax, and go up and up with the semantic, and then possibly with other methods in text mining for other, let's say, purposes and other research questions. Greek and Latin are well represented, as you can see here. And also in this slide, this is for you, I have a link to these slides, you can find links. Again, you have these long lists. I'm not going through this list where you have different methods for dealing with character encoding, for lemmatizing the text. But analyzing the language is the first need, because we have resources also in ancient Greek and Latin, but not so many corpora well structured. We still have many translations into modern languages, but we need a data set where we have information about languages. And I have examples for these last slides. To give you a few, let's say, insights. Linguistic annotation. Linguistic annotation, there are interesting projects today for annotating semi-automatically. So you can annotate a first set of data manually, and then you can train the machine to automatize partly, of course, this task. For doing what? For annotating the morphology of ancient languages and then possibly the syntax. In this screenshot, you can see also example of visualizations. Today, we have nice methods for representing in the text for each word, basically the part of speech, the function of each word in the text. And then we can represent with the trees the syntax. Again, link the data. You can say the syntax. I'm not a linguist. I am a philologist. I am a historiographer. Yes, but I think that the linguistic analysis, of course, linguistic annotation, many projects have a focus on pure linguistics. But the language is interesting also when we want to study a text for literature, for historiography, for philology, etc. For example, you can align the linguistic annotations of two different manuscripts of the same text, and starting with the language, analyze possible variants. And then, of course, you can use this data for many other purposes. And visualizations are also interesting, also for educational purposes. I think that today we could do many things, especially in the high school, for teaching ancient Greek and Latin using computational linguistics. Then, link the data. For Latin, I mentioned in the project the link in Latin. I don't know if you know that this is a knowledge base for Latin, a project developed in Milano at the Università Cattolica in Milano. And this is an interesting knowledge base. Basically, this is a resource for collecting linguistic data about Latin in general. Again, there is a strong linguistic component. In this slide, you see the example. You can search this resource using SparkQL. Yes, is a language for searching databases. And for example, in this slide, you have the example starting with the lemma admiror in Latin. You can find many connections to, of course, linguistic forms, but through text, you can align text for different purposes, again, in historiography, philology, linguistics, and also to metadata about authors and works. These are examples in computational linguistics. Then, moving beyond, another interesting method is name-entity recognition, the semantic. You can train the machine, this is what I'm doing for some of my projects, to train the machine to detect proper names in a text. And name-entity is a technique in natural language processing, focusing on personal names. And we are beginning to produce data also for classical languages where traditionally we don't have enough data. Because if you consider also dictionaries, and many resources in computational linguistics today are based on the digitization of printed dictionaries, in these dictionaries you don't really have so many proper names. Also, if you consider a resource like the Liddell Scott Jones for ancient Greek, but proper names are interesting because through them you can first structure the text. You consider this is a screenshot, this is an example of an output. But when you have your text, you can help the machine to begin to structure the text, for example, individuating proper names. And proper names are interesting because then you can focus on onomastics, on geography, on place names. And through them, you can explore, for example, different names of the same place over the centuries, variants of proper personal names and place names in different versions of the same text, in different manuscripts. And so you can always use these methods for different purposes. Name entities is interesting. The difficulty is with highly inflected languages like ancient Greek and Latin is to individuate the inflected form, to lemmatize the form, and then to disambiguate the specific form. And we have many ambiguities in our text. But this is another example. So you can see there is digital technologies that now are focused a lot on let's say, structuring text, structuring corpora, and starting with a linguistic analysis. Then moving beyond, when you have, for example, enough data, also linguistic data, you can move to textual alignment. This is another screenshot where you can align using distances. For example, you can align an ancient Greek text with forms in Latin or in modern languages. This is an example where I'm automatically aligning an ancient Greek text with indices of critical editions. These are lists of proper names digitized from a critical edition, and I can align these forms with the Greek text. And basically, this is for measuring the distance between the method is about the distance, so you can computationally align, measure the distance between, and again, proper names, and this is a way for individuating not only proper names, other forms in the text and structure in the text. Textual alignment can be also used for aligning, again, two different versions of the same text for philological purposes. This is why I was mentioning the future of the critical apparatus and of the critical edition. Do we want to collect every variant? This is an open question for philologists. Then translation alignment is another interesting technique developed for modern languages. We use every day translation alignment for modern languages. We have many tools, also on social networks, in Google, etc. There are experiments also for historical languages, where there are many challenges because, of course, aligning translations is a very complex task, but again, we can measure the difference between a text and its translations. This is an example of, again, old editions, Greek text and the Latin, the Latin of scholars of the 19th century when Latin was still used for translations. But translation alignment is interesting not only to explore how a certain ancient text is translated into different languages, but also for generating data, because we can align the Greek and the Latin, and then we can have these pairs and connect, for example, forms of names in ancient Greek with lists of these forms in modern collections and get metadata from them. So translation alignment is another interesting text. Text reuse detection. Text reuse detection is used mainly, is again about measuring the distance between a text. Text reuse detection works for us when we want to explore the reuse, the citation of still extant authors in later sources. There are projects, for example, for detecting Platonic reuses, Platonic quotations in literature, also Homeric quotations. It is interesting because, again, is and I have used this in the project in the Fragmenti Historicorum Graecorum for detecting quotations of historians. Of course, it's a bit problematic for detecting quotations of lost authors, and we know that fragmentary literature for us in Greek and Latin is a problematic, let's say, task, because in that case, we can't really detect lost text. So we have to use text reuse detection in a different way to detect citations in a text, especially hidden citations. Then for the last, I have only 3 slides and I'm done. Annotations. Annotations, again, I have already mentioned annotations, linguistic annotation. Linguistic annotation can be performed manually, automatically, or semi-automatically. And there are tools today for trying to extract semi-automatically information from a text, but also for experimenting with this annotation manually. This is an example of a screenshot where you have a text in Inception, which is a web-based platform tool for annotating text, where you can, for example, in this project, highlight words corresponding to author names in ancient Greek and the titles of their works. And you can also align annotations with different layers where you annotate, I don't know, Ctesias is first of all a personal name in ancient Greek, but is also the name of an author in certain context. And you can align a text like this with the image of the manuscript preserving the text. That is the Deipnos office, where you find the text. And there are also ways for aligning precisely the text with the forms, highlighting regions of interest in the image. Then, of course, you can play with different visualizations, like when you annotate the text and you extract, for example, Plato, you can generate also a concordance, and then you can play with different visualizations, like clustering the text and then visualizing, for example, where Plato is cited in ancient Greek sources, how he is cited. This is a traditional concordance, but of course you can generate other visualizations. And then, yes, this is an example of starting with highlighting proper names refer to authors. You can visualize in the text, for example, the occurrences of the name of the philosopher Plato. Then you have to disambiguate because we also have the comic poet Plato and references to his works, and connect this data with a catalog. This is my project now to create a text-based catalog where I create this linked data between sources, specific editions of ancient sources, where linguistic forms in the text referring to author names and work titles are connected with the metadata in catalogs. And you can see metadata in Latin and also in other languages, and then also to Wikidata. So this is an example of linked data, where you can really point to the text, moving beyond the traditional labels like fragmenta or forms in modern languages or in Latin for ancient Greek sources. Last, geoannotations. Of course, if you extract linguistic data, you can also play, for example, with geoannotations. There are different projects for annotating sources with a focus on place names. And okay, generating a map, which is a bit a nice tool, okay, to play a bit with these maps. But the interesting thing of geoannotations is that you can really explore the variety and the richness of ancient sources in terms of place names, considering also the difficulties. And these are two examples where you can generate maps extracting place names in ancient Greek or also in modern translations. And also I did an experiment. Well, I completed for a specific text, the Marmorparium, which is an inscription. I generated the map and there are linguistic resources, but these I can skip on this. Last slide. Corpora. Of course, I'm referring here to an open corpus, the Perseus project. I work with the Perseus project and I put numbers there. To count numbers of works, editions, and translations, and also words is not an easy task. What do we mean by word? There are other expressions like token, where you consider not only the word, but also punctuation, which is usually separated by a word. So counting our corpora is a difficult task. But I'm mentioning this because sometimes it's also important to have a sense of what we have now for ancient Greek and Latin. We have other projects that are not open, which is another complexity. But again, to conclude, digital technologies today, you say, okay, I don't know how to generate these maps. I don't know how to annotate a text. If you want to start or move on, so first, the focus is on creating a corpus. If you have a specific research question, and I imagine you have many research questions, you are PhD candidates, and you want to use digital technology, look for a corpus. You can create your corpus, your clean corpus, possibly, and then step by step, starting with your research question, you can move to, of course, linguistic annotations, then text mining. I didn't mention many other methods like topic modeling, network analysis. Of course, again, we could devote an entire workshop to many possible things. But I think that important is to focus on this. Produce clean data as far as possible and start with the corpus, with the structure corpus, and then step by step, involving other scholars, of course, and the community, move on with your questions. I spent 10 minutes more, but I thank you very much for your attention, for your patience.